Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. I'm Tunde Abiola.
And I'm Oji Akbe.
Recently, the Central Bank of Nigeria reported that two global banking giants, HSBC and UBS, closed their respective offices and shut down operations in Nigeria. This has come in the wake of a prediction about the Nigerian economy by one of the banks, which believes that a second term in office for President Muhammadu Buhari would spell doom for the economic well-being of Nigeria. It is not clear whether the decision of the banks to pull out of Nigeria was a direct consequence of that prediction. What remains clear, however, is that Nigeria's economy has been unstable for quite some time, even in the face of rising prices of oil in the international market. Is the current economic outlook a good one for the country? Joining us now to take a look at this and a lot more is the Director General of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Mr. Muda Yusuf. Mr. Yusuf, you're welcome to the program.
Good morning, sir. Thank you for joining us on the program today.
Thank you very much.
All right, so can you bring us to date with the statistics about inflation here in Nigeria? What's the situation right now?
Well, if you look at the economy, I think we look at it from a number of perspectives.
Okay.
There is the macroeconomic perspective, where you'll be looking at the GDP performance, for instance, which as at the last quarter was about 1.5%. I will be looking at things like the inflation rate, which is slightly over 11%. It has been rising, although gradually. We'll be looking at things like exchange rate. How stable is it? Because it's also a very important macroeconomic indicator. And over the last few months, it has been relatively stable, although the stability has been supported by regular interventions by the Central Bank of Nigeria. They'll be looking at things like interest rates, we'll be looking at things like our foreign reserves, which has come under pressure lately because of issues of uncertainty and issues to some extent of declining confidence in the general economic environment. That has also been putting some pressure on the foreign reserves. So on the macroeconomic front, things are not looking that badly.
Okay.
You know, even though we have issues here and there, especially arising from the fact that, okay, the election is coming, there are challenges of uncertainty, there are a few regulatory issues here and there, which may have led to some reactions, a part of which is what you mentioned. Then there is also the private sector perspective of the economy, because the macroeconomic indicators are not ends in themselves. They are means to an end. So when you say that the economy is doing well or not doing well, it depends on how it is impacting on businesses and how it is impacting on the citizens. So from the point of view of business, we'll be looking at things like the profitability of business. What is the cost of doing business? What is the performance with doing business ranking, global competitiveness, you know, cost of operations, profitability? Those are issues that matter to the business person. So if you say that, okay, the macroeconomy is good, there's positive GDP growth, but if the business person is saying that the environment is becoming increasingly very challenging, it affects profitability, it affects sustainability. So from the business person's point of view, it's not likely to rate the economy as doing very well. Then you have the household perspective. This has to do with the citizens. Because many of the citizens, when you tell them that the economy is out of recession, economy recovering, they say they are not feeling it. So from the point of view of the citizen, what matters is welfare. So when you are talking economics, what will make sense to the citizen is the impact on welfare.
Okay, but
We are talking about the basic needs like access to food, access to good health care, access to education, cost of transportation, general well-being of the citizen. So these are the three key areas from which you can actually properly evaluate the performance of the economy.
So can you really say that we are out of recession?
Well, we are out of recession technically, because recession is about the statistics as far as the GDP performance is concerned. If you have two consecutive decline in your GDP, contraction in your GDP, then you see that you are in recession. But now we have been in positive territory. And for the past 2 or 3 quarters, We have been in positive territory. So technically, we are out of recession. But again, just as I said, what matters to investors, what matters to the citizens are those variables that I've mentioned.
So there's a huge
difference. If those
difference.
variables are not doing well, then we still have issues.
So there's a difference between the technical facts and figures that you've outlined and the practical, the effects of the average Nigerian household. So we can say technically we're out of recession, but it's not being felt at home by your average Nigerian. What causes this disconnect?
Well, the issue is that, you know, the macroeconomic fundamentals are very good. They are necessary condition for all these other variables to perform well, but they are not sufficient. So if you have a GDP growth that is doing well, you need to look at what is actually driving the growth. If the growth is coming maybe from oil, which is what it has been, then you cannot say that it is inclusive. Because the oil sector, by its very nature, is not a very inclusive sector. You know? So it depends on what segments of the economy are contributing to the growth. So already the manufacturing sector is not doing so well. The agricultural sector is not doing so well. Even the service sector and all of them. There are still serious challenges with costs of doing business. There are still serious challenges with unemployment. There are still serious challenges with a lot of variables that impact. I mean, take power, for instance. The cost of diesel has gone up to over around 250 naira per liter. No, from around 160 or 170 that it was some. I know the impact of that on business across all sectors. Whether you are talking of manufacturing, you are talking of the service sector, the cost of energy is a big issue. And if you are in the business that requires high logistics component, in other words, that requires you clearing cargo from the ports, traveling, moving the cargo to different parts of the country, either raw materials or finished goods across the country. Transportation is still a very big issue. So these are issues. Then we talk of financing. You need to fund business with bank funding most of the time. Of course, there's debt financing, there's equity financing. But the cost of credit now is also very high.
Yes.
So these are some of the challenges that create the disconnect between the macroeconomic performance and the firm level or household performance. So it's a question of the investment environment. It's also a question of the kind of social investment that you also make. Because right now, the government hasn't had the financing to properly fund the budget. Because as we speak, we are already in November. Capital budget performance in terms of implementation and releases is just about 30%.
So the government right now...
So all these issues are the things that create the problems and create the disconnect between the macroeconomic numbers and the actual performance.
The government right now recognizes the need for funding and has proposed, amongst other things, the sale of public assets in a bid to raise 289 billion naira. There's been a lot of resistance towards this, a lot of criticism of this policy, and it's been put most succinctly that it's like selling your family house to spend the money on a holiday. But what would you think? Because the government, I think, they're trying to avoid the reliance on borrowing and trying to internally generate money, but it's encountering a lot of resistance. What is your take on this?
You see, selling of assets, it depends on what kind of assets you are selling. There are some assets that actually constitute a burden on the economy, on the government, and on the citizens. So if you sell off such kind of assets, it's like good riddance. It reduces the burden on the economy. Take, for instance, our refineries. We are an oil-producing country, and we are one of the biggest importers of refined petroleum products. And yet we have about 4 refineries thereabouts. These refineries have not been functioning optimally over the years, not just under this regime. And the challenge is that when you put such an enterprise within the domain of the public sector to manage, it's not in the place of the bureaucracy to be managing such an enterprise. The bureaucracy are more suited to manage things that are social in nature. Can be talking of health, can be talking of education. Even in the social space, the private sector is even doing much more than the public sector. And that is the challenge we have in the economy. So if you put things like refineries up for sale, why not? Because ordinarily refineries should be making huge profits and be supporting government in funding and finances. That's correct. But it's the other way around. The refineries have been declaring losses over the years. Can you compare what is happening to the refineries to what is happening to NLNG? Whereas NLNG is declaring dividends to government, billions of dollars, the refineries are declaring losses.
Well, NLNG is also up for sale, according to the government's economic plans.
Well, the government is not clear yet on that. What the government is talking about is selling down part of its shares in LNG. I think it has about 49%. Yes. If you sell about 5% or 10%, that can fetch a lot of revenue. But what is important in all of this is to look at the totality of our basket of revenue and see how we can optimize it, and also look at the areas in which we are having leakages, possibly even bleeding of the economy. You know, that is what is important. Look, for instance, you need revenue from the private, you need taxes from the private sector. If the environment is not conducive, because you pay taxes on profit, if the businesses are not making profit, where will the revenue come from? So the environment is a key issue. Then we have these issues with oil and gas sector. Now, a lot of investors in the upstream, for instance, are complaining that the policy environment is not conducive for investment in oil and gas, especially upstream and even downstream. So a lot of financing that should have come in there are not coming in. And you need investment to actually boost an economy. If you say you don't have revenue, you need investors to be able to do the business and pay you tax revenue. But if your institutions, your regulatory environment, your policy environment is not conducive for these investors to come, then we have an issue. So we have a big policy issue and maybe regulatory issue in the oil and gas sector. So that has been impeding a lot of investment. Then we have this oil subsidy. It is the biggest area of bleeding of the economy as we speak.
Now, how do you think that can be resolved?
Because if subsidy? The situation now from the figures we have is that we are importing or we are consuming about 60 to 65 million liters of PMS every day. And because we are not refining, all these things are imported. And for every liter, there's a huge subsidy on every liter. And we have a situation now where we are spending close to 1.5 trillion or even more to subsidize. Whereas our total capital budget is less than, it's just about 400 billion. You know, for infrastructure, it's just about 400. Total capital budget is about 2.8 in the budget. And the performance, as we speak in October, is just about 30%. So if we have refineries that function, importation of petroleum products will stop. And we make huge savings from all this revenue, because you know what 1.5 trillion can do to an economy. Our infrastructures are collapsing. The roads are not so good. The public institutions are complaining of funding. Go to any ministry today. The constant complaint across all the MDAs is funding.
So I am sure that the federal government is aware about everything that you've just said right now, correct? They're very sure of what you're saying.
Of course. But you know, some of these things...
My real question is, what is the problem? Like, why aren't they taking all these into account to actually fix the problem?
Well, first, there is the political economy of some of these things. You know, sometimes what will make an economic sense may not make political sense. You know, when you bring political judgment to bear on economic issues, sometimes it affects the coloration of your decision. It affects the kind of outcomes that you get. For instance, to deal with the issue of subsidy at this time is also a very difficult thing. Because that will mean that oil price will have to go up, and you know the reaction of citizens.
Well, the oil prices did go up. They did go up.
Yes, but if you withdraw it now, it will go up even more. That is the point I'm making. And which politically may not be experienced at this time. Okay. But what I have concerns with is the fact that the government is still holding on to the issue of the refineries up till now.
Yes.
Because you cannot have a sector that is supposed to be spinning a lot of revenue, becoming a hole in the finances of government.
Not only a revenue spinner, but a revenue spinner, the revenue spinner in a mono economy. We're in a vulnerable position where our oil and gas sector is not functioning at full capacity because of political expediency. So much has been sacrificed on the altar of political expediency. And we have a situation now, you just discussed how we spend trillions importing. Our produce, agricultural produce, is not accepted in the European Union. 67 food items from Nigeria were banned for use of pesticides and other standards breaches. I mean, what would you say about that? What is your take on that? To sort of diversify our economy, because even an individual cannot have one stream of income.
Yes. Before I go to the issue of the agricultural product, when we talk of diversification, even within the oil and gas space, there's need for diversification. Because the only thing we do now is just to export the crude. Whereas there's a lot more that we can do in that space. We just talked about the refineries, there is the petrochemicals, there is the fertilizer, not just producing for local consumption, but also even for exports. So there's a whole lot that can be done even within the oil and gas space. Then, in terms of revenue, there are some government agencies that normally should bring in a lot more revenue than they are bringing in now. That's what we call the independent revenue under the revenue head of the budget. And consistently, the shortfall under that head has been sometimes above 50%. Because there is no sufficient pressure to ensure proper accountability in some of those areas, to ensure that those critical revenue-generating agencies remit adequately to the Federation account. That was why sometimes in the past, the FAC meeting and all of that were deadlocked, because the governors and the NNPC were at loggerheads as to what exactly should be brought into the Federation account. So the political will to get some revenue-generating agencies to remit properly to the comforts of government is part of the issues we have that is affecting revenue. Then you talk about the agricultural products. It's about capacity and it's about the quality of institutions. Because the capacity and productivity in agric is very weak as we speak because of the generality of the operating environment of those who are in the agricultural sector. So that is affecting the quality of their product. Then when the institutions are also not very sound, things are easily compromised. Those who are supposed to do proper checks, because they are compromised, they don't do the proper checks, they just sign on to documents, and things go. And again, there are some unscrupulous private sector players who also cut corners rather than go through the normal channels. They bypass it and take these things abroad. So all these things contribute to the kind of perception, because a lot of it is also perception. You know.
Given that we're experiencing what we may term stagnation and non-inclusive growth, what would you recommend that the government should do?
You see, the way to make the economy more inclusive is to create an enabling environment for all the different players in the economy. That is the way, that is what we need to do to encourage every part of the economy to bring something to the table. If you are in manufacturing, it should be easy for you to manufacture profitably and sustainably. If you are in the service sector, it should be easy for you to do so. And at the center of all of this is infrastructure. It's infrastructure. Because if you don't have infrastructure, you can't get your non-oil economy to perform well, to perform optimally. A lot of people are struggling to get businesses running. The mortality rate of small businesses is very high. And Nigerians are very enterprising people. And you need to see what Nigerians go through to do business. It's not that difficult in many other climes. That is why when Nigerians go elsewhere, it is very easy for them to dominate in terms of enterprise. But we need to create the environment in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of the funding, in terms of the regulatory environment, in terms of the policy environment, in terms of the tax environment. All those things are critical. Once you do that, because it is entrepreneurs that create wealth, it is entrepreneurs that generate employment. So they are the ones that will bring the investment to the table. They could be foreign entrepreneurs or foreign investors. They could be domestic entrepreneurs or domestic investors. But if you don't create the environment, you cannot get the economy to move, and you cannot create the kind of inclusiveness that you need to create in an economy. So it all boils down to the kind of environment that you create for domestic investors and for foreign investors. Okay, so that is what will make the difference.
Right, right. So let's talk about the agricultural sector right now.
Yes.
To what extent do you think that the herdsmen clashes have affected that sector? I mean, that's the second well-generated sector in our economy right now. So what do you think about that?
Well, I don't think agriculture is the second wealth-generating sector.
I mean the agricultural sector.
I know, yes, because it's also one of the most challenged sectors in terms of productivity. That is why one of the poorest set of economic players in this economy are the farmers. Right. If the agriculture sector was doing so well, the farmers will not be as poor as they are. But having said that, the herdsmen something has adversely and seriously affected the agricultural sector. It has led, obviously, to a lot of dislocation. Many of the farmers who are supposed to be on their farms are now in the IDP camps. And many of these farmers, that is all that they have. And unfortunately, the main target of all these herdsmen are the farming communities. You know, and all the agricultural belts across the country have been affected, right from the northeast to northwest to north central, even to southeast and south-south. So it's a major problem that is affecting the agricultural sector, even though these people are peasant farmers, but they are the main drivers of that sector. So to the extent that there are security issues in all these communities, to that extent, can we say that the agricultural sector has suffered a very serious setback? And that is why if you look at the numbers, our GDP numbers, you see that there is a decline in the performance of the sector. And that's one of the critical factors that have caused that is the security problem that has been created by this herdsmen invasion of the farming communities across the country.
So in terms of also the federal government, right, and in terms of the infrastructure investment and other parts of the economy, what would you advise in terms of our debt, our rising debt portfolio right now?
You see, the challenge with the debt portfolio, first, our debt portfolio currently is about 73 billion US dollars. Over 70% of that is domestic debt. So first, there is the issue of the cost at which we borrow. We borrowed at a very high cost over the years. That is one. Secondly, it's about what we use the debt for. Because if you borrow either as an individual or as a company or as a country, if you borrow to invest, servicing the debt will not be a major issue because you will have built your capacity to service the debt. But unfortunately, in our own case, we don't have much to show for the borrowing.
Yeah, we spend it on recurrent expenses.
Yes. If you look at our budgets, almost 80%. It's only in this regime that at least we managed to increase capital budget to about 30%. Over the years, the recurrent has been about 80%. So if you are borrowing to be running the business of government, it's like borrowing for consumption, more or less. And you create problems for future generations, which is what we are facing now. Debt service in the 2018 budget is about 2 trillion. Total capital budget is about 2.8 trillion. That's almost 80% of capital budget. So that shows how bad the situation is. Right. And the problem with the debt service is that it's first-line charge. Once you have your revenue, it's the first thing that will go before you do any other thing. If you look at even the recent budget implementation report read out by, I think, the Minister of Finance, you can see that if you take out the payment of salary, you take out debt service, the money is finished.
There's nothing left,
Nothing left. So it's a major problem, and the way out, first, is what the government has been doing. The government is trying to do a rebalancing of the debt portfolio because the domestic debt turned out to be more expensive than the foreign debt.
Right.
And because it's also short-term, it's more difficult to service. So government is trying to switch from domestic to foreign. But again, if you are taking foreign debt, it is better for it to be tied to specific projects.
Right.
If you continue with the same style of taking the money, throwing it into federation accounts, using it to run the business of government, we'll be back to square one. So we need to look at first the cost of borrowing, then the kind of borrowing that we take, and the purpose for which we also take this borrowing. I mean, so these are the things. It is better for a country like ours, like any other developing country, to be looking more at debts that are concessionary debts, concessionary loans, which are very low and which also have very long repayment period. Okay. Those are the things that we need to do. And we should also not be making the mistake of assessing the status of our debt by relating to the GDP.
Okay.
That doesn't fit into our own environment. Okay. You use debt to GDP ratio where the key components of your GDP are revenue generating. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. If your key components are not revenue generating, it's a very defective parameter to assess your GDP performance. Well, because your debt to GDP ratio is low, then you have room to pay. No, yeah, exactly. Because agricultural sector, for instance, accounts for about 23% of GDP. It doesn't account for up to 1% of revenue. So how do you use that to be assessing your debt to GDP? Your distributive trade sector is about 15% of GDP. How much tax do you get from distributive trade? Because most of them are in the informal sector. How much tax do you get from there? So what is more important is the capacity to service the debt. Debt to revenue ratio.
Debt to revenue ratio.
Yes, that is more like it for our own environment. And that will show us a much clearer picture because our debt to revenue ratio is so high. You know?
Okay. So what would you say the ideal role of the Chamber of Commerce in trying to re-engineer the country's economy away from, the vast inflation that we are facing right now?
Well, the Chamber of Commerce is a platform to aggregate private sector views on the economy, which is part of what I'm telling you now. There are issues, different kinds of issues. There are policy issues, there are regulatory issues that the private sector confronts from time to time. And there's always a need to engage the government. Because sometimes some of the things you see as policies or as some actions of the regulators are informed sometimes by ignorance, by inadequate communication between the business community and those who are in government. So the Chamber of Commerce provides a channel of communication between the business community and the government, just as other business associations. We also have the Manufacturers Association. We have the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. We have quite a number of them. So the whole idea is to provide a platform to influence the direction of policy and to ensure seamless communication between government and the private sector. Because the government officials severally have told us, because we hold this quarterly parley with the vice president, and the whole idea of the parley is to get feedback from the private sector. And they have told us that the feedback is also necessary to enrich the quality of policy. Because if there is no feedback, there is no way the government can know whether the policy is performing or policies are not performing. So that is one major issue. Then as a business organization, we also help to also support small businesses. Because almost 90% of businesses, if not more, in the economy are SMEs. And they need to be supported. They need to be supported through capacity building. They need to be supported through financing. They need to be supported with information. They need to be supported in many ways, enlightenment and capacity building. So the Chamber of Commerce also, we do quite a lot of that. And of course, we organize the trade fair. Our trade fair is ending today, the Lagos International Trade Fair. Okay. It's the biggest platform, to showcase what Nigerian business and foreign businesses have to offer the Nigerian market and even the regional market. So that is also a major function that the Chamber of Commerce performs, to support the economy and to support private sector development. Okay, so still on inflation, right? Yes.
For our ordinary Nigerians, how can you let us know how to prevent inflation? The cause of inflation, and part of it is, taxation. Obviously, right now the government is negotiating the minimum wage, and I know that obviously once you have a higher income, it does affect the inflation. So how can we, as ordinary Nigeria, also help the government to, prevent inflation?
Well, as ordinary Nigerians, there's very little the ordinary Nigerian can do. Because the main drivers of inflation are first cost. If you are producing something and you are buying diesel at 260 naira or 250 naira per liter, you are not producing for charity. You are producing for profit. So that's what you call cost push inflation. If the cost environment is high, prices. So the government has to do something about cost. Talk of cost of energy. If you are in agricultural production, you are in logistics, you have to move your products from one point to the other. And the cost of transportation is high. You are not going to the market to be selling for charity. You are in business to make money. So you have to factor the cost of transportation into your cost. So if the cost of transportation is high, your price will be high. So to such a person, the best thing to do is to see how you can bring down the cost of transportation. And some of the things that affect cost of transport is the quality of the roads. For those of us that travel occasionally by road, the situation is really very bad.
Correct.
And it affects cost of transportation. And once that is high, it affects cost of agricultural products. Then there is also the monetary phenomenon. That is the rate at which government incurs deficit. If there is too much of deficit financing in the economy, it has a way of pushing up what you call money supply. If the money supply is too high, it also has a way of weakening the currency and weakening purchasing power. So there is a cost push, there is the monetary phenomenon, and there is also the macroeconomic environment that could lead to inflation. Of course, you talk about minimum wage. Yes, but giving somebody 30,000 a month, it's not too much, for goodness sake.
So it doesn't.
If you want to fight inflation, let's look at other areas to deal with inflation. Not to say that you should not give somebody 30,000 because of inflation. That will not be fair.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this segment.
Thank you
it was
so much.
quite insightful to have you here.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's time now for a short break. When we return, Betty Abba, the Executive Director of See Hope Nigeria, a girl child rights and development non-profit-based organization, will be joining us in the studio to discuss the rising incidence of child sexual abuse and domestic violence in Nigeria and the way forward. Stay with us.